Hey guys, today's video we're going to be talking about how to prepare for your coding or software interviews. So we can think about it in 3 steps. The first step is your planning phase when you start actually sending out your resume and applying for jobs. The middle phase is where you actually conduct your phone interviews, your coding assessments, and then your final interviews. And then after each one of those steps, the final phase is actually talking with the recruiter and the team on potential next steps or a rejection. So let's start off with the first part of first part of programming interviews. So this is where you can be really honest with yourself. Depending on how well your background in data structure and algorithms is going to be dependent on how much you prepare. So let's just say that you're amazing and very attuned, and you find data structures and algorithms very intuitive. So it's no issue for you to solve hard, medium questions on LeetCode or Algo Export or any other coding platform, like Codeforces, for example. Then it might only take you a couple days to prepare a refresher of a couple different patterns. If you're on the other hand like me, where you're more a self-taught programmer and didn't have necessarily that foundation in data structure and algorithms, then it could take you months to prepare. So what is the best way to prepare? The best way to prepare is to just practice every single day and know the timeline for your final interviews. So what interviews are most important for you? So with anything, you want some practice. So you're going to want to get as much in-person interview practice as possible. So how do you do that? You apply to a lot of different companies. Maybe there's not your first choice, but you set them up before your final interviews. So think about scheduling your most targeted companies later on in the process when you have this practice. So once you start applying with your resume, don't necessarily feel bad if you apply for positions that are maybe a little bit higher than your level. Think of a job posting as a wish list. They're going to contact you or not contact you depending on what you send them, and it's just your job to be as prepared as possible for that interview. So let's say you start getting your interviews. How do you prepare? What's the timeline? So let's just consider a whole job hunting process as 1 to 3 months. So if you know that your data structures and algorithms background is very weak or light, like mine, you're going to need maybe months, maybe greater than 3 months to prepare. And that was my case as well, because I wasn't used to solving LeetCode or algorithmic style questions. So what I did is I just started doing it every single day. I used multiple resources. For me, I utilized LeetCode and Algo Expert and a bunch of different books. One book I really like, especially for Java, is Elements of Programming Interviews in Java. It really breaks down everything. It actually, like another book I'm going to recommend by Gail McDowell Lackman, Cracking the Coding Interview. They both have timelines. So just follow those timelines. Those are a pretty good approximation of how much you can study. But in general, for me, what I found most useful was just coding every single day, and then focusing on kind of 2 different techniques. So the first technique is like whatever company that you're applying for. For example, LeetCode, if you have the premium option or premium access to the content, you can look at interview questions that were recently asked by that company. So let's say you're interviewing at Google or Facebook, you can get a lot or practice a lot of those questions. So they usually have a list of 50 to 100 questions that you can go through. So I would just go through those and then try to understand the process. So the typical way you're going to do it is try to blind on new questions, just try to answer that question inefficiently as possible for 25 minutes and look at the answer if you can't solve it, but don't look at it too long. Just look at it enough where you understand maybe the pattern that you're not recognizing. Maybe a certain problem uses a heap or a queue and you didn't even think about that. You were thinking about more brute force style. But with every type of algorithmic question or coding interview question, just think about this. Try to solve it as inefficiently as possible or in a brute force way, and then try to do the more fancy optimized stuff later. So that might mean using a nested for loop or a double for loop to iterate over an array, and then later you might find a way to use a hash map to maybe increase the memory but also increase the speed. And that's also another topic that you're going to have to prepare for, especially if you don't have that background in data structures and algorithms, and that's understanding big O notation. So just familiarize yourself with the common time and space complexity for certain data structures, and also certain algorithms. So for example, you should know that most sorting algorithms take O n log n time, and then O n space. The reason I know that is because I was able to, over and over again to use sorting algorithms and just kind of memorize that fact to be completely honest. But then you'll know, or you'll be working with certain data structures over and over again, like a hash map. They have their own advantages and disadvantages compared to other data structures. So with anything else in programming, it's understanding and engineering an outcome based on trade-offs. So all these data structures and algorithms have different trade-offs between time and space. So for example, let's say that you do use a double for loop, but you want to solve that question in a faster amount of time. You could potentially use a data structure called a hash map, in which it's well known that you can access, search and access the same thing, delete, and then also insert elements in constant or O1 time. So it's just stuff that you pick up as you go. So another service I really liked was Algo Expert. The reason I like that, and LeetCode's kind of catching up here, but they provide video solutions. I'm a more visual person, especially when it comes to understanding algorithmic design, and that was really helpful me understanding the actual algorithms, data structures, and the value there. And then also there's a great MIT course on data structure and algorithms. I'll include it below, but feel free to watch that in the background as you're preparing an interview, and it'll help you a lot. Finally, in preparation, before your final interviews that you care most about, make sure that you interview or mock interview with other people in person or virtually. It's going to help you kind of work out the kinks, because at the end of the day, an interview is just a social process, and you got to understand the emotional cues and body language that the interviewees get giving you. A lot of times people are so focused on answering the problem, they're not actively listening to what the interviewer is asking them. So, hey guys, I also wanted to include a little bit of advice from one of my friends, an anonymous Google software engineer, on how you prepare for his interviews. So enjoy.
To get into a company like Google, I would advise first to know exactly how the interview is going to look like for your specific role. For example, a junior engineer might have just one simple coding task on the screening interview, and then on the on-site interview stage, they're going to have 5 back-to-back interviews of the same kind with the same type of assignment. In comparison to that, another person with 10 plus years of experience would definitely have in addition to that, would have a system design interview and a behavioral interview. So knowing exactly what interviewers are going to have is mandatory. And after that, the most impactful way to prepare for them would be to do a mock interview with a real person following the format of the interview you are targeting. That by far is going to give you the best results.
More often than not, a lot of newer software engineers, they tend to want to answer the question as quickly as possible without clarifying the question being asked, listening for cues from the actual interviewer. And by asking clarifying questions, you can catch use cases. You can kind of test your assumptions. So for example, like you would ask them if you can assume if you have valid input, or you have to consider like negative numbers, and the list goes on. But by asking those questions, you're able to add constraints and confine the scope of the problem. And when you don't ask that, you might end up actually answering the wrong problem. So it is very important that you ask these questions, because it shows that you're listening, but also it helps you make sure that you're not answering the wrong question. So just make sure to listen. I'm also going to include a post from Blind, and it's titled Confessions of a Fang Manager. And basically that was one of the big points I got. A lot of interviewees don't actively listen, and that kind of goes against them. It's not necessarily about answering the problem, even though that's important. It's more about, how's it like to communicate and work with this person. That's what they're checking for. So let's say that you're going through the phone interviews, you're going through the final interviews either virtually or in person. A couple tips I would recommend for you to just prepare for that day and remain calm. So if you tend to be a more anxious person, I also kind of find that interviews tend to be more of anxiety testing test or something like that. Like usually the most calm person or the calm interviewee ends up getting the job. So I'm sure we've all seen this phenomenon where the job you don't care or the job you are applying for that you don't necessarily care about, you tend to do better in. It's because you're putting less stakes and less pressure on yourself to perform. So just remember when you're interviewing, if you are an anxious person, just make sure you can meditate maybe 10 minutes a day. And that has calmed myself down a lot and helped me prepare for my interviews. Is when you're interviewing for different companies, they usually have a way or a page on their website or a study guide in order to perform well on their interviews. Each interview is different. To give you an example, Google tends to ask more algorithmic design questions. They also care about edge cases and making sure they don't have bugs in your code. Facebook more considers like how fast you can solve stuff and bug-free code. So for example, they might ask you, well, Facebook in that case might ask you 2 algorithmic interview questions and expect you to do that in the 45 minutes, while Google might ask you a harder question, 1, but expect you to do it in that time. And all these companies expect you to like clearly communicate your thought process because it helps them understand your thought process in general. A final piece of advice I'm gonna say is that expect a lot of rejection as you're going through the process, and that's fine. Maybe you have a lot more experience in these data structures and algorithms and you get multiple offers, and that's great. Consider more focusing on negotiation and getting the best deal for yourself and the best area and opportunity for you to learn. But for the newcomers like I was last year, I bombed a couple of interviews. I bombed my Bloomberg interview, I bombed my Uber interview, but that's fine. It's part of the learning process. There's interviews I thought I did well in and I didn't end up getting the job, but that's fine. You only need one company to say yes. So don't lose hope. I'll add all the study prep material in the description of this video. And I hope you have a nice day. Thanks for watching this video. Cheers.